Hello and welcome. My name is Leslie Anderson. I am the Chief Curator here at the National Nordic Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture, How Many Nordic States?, produced in partnership with the University of Washington Department of Scandinavian Studies. And I'd just like to take a moment and thank this department for their long-standing partnership and collaboration over the course of many programs and many years. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrew Nestingen, Chair of the Department of Scandinavian Studies.
Thank you. Great to see everyone. Made it through the snow. Let's hope it's not piling up out there right now. My name is Andy Nestingen, as Leslie said. Thank you, Leslie, for the introduction, and it is such a pleasure to be here for our guest lecture tonight by our distinguished visiting Fulbright professor, whose activities I will come to in a moment. But it is a very special moment here to be together on the topic of kind of the broader Baltic region, and I think that is the distinguishing feature and identity of our department, Nordic and Baltic, and we're extremely proud of that and have built up some amazing activities over the years, both scholarly, with our teaching of students and so forth. So it's a moment of pride as well to be here and to join you to hear tonight's talk. And I just want to say thank you to our Baltic faculty, in particular Professor Gunther Smidgens, for making this possible. He among other things, got extra napkins for the catering tonight and was just like the person solving all the problems. So we're, as usual. Great. So here's a question for you to contemplate tonight. How many Nordics are there? It sounds like a joke, right? How many Norwegians or Estonians or Swedes does it take to, you can do the rest. But the thing is about that question is the Nordic, I was thinking about this in English, Nordic is not a noun, right? So how do you count them up? A bit of a problem. 8 different small nations distinguished by their national politics. Is it eight, 5? Scandinavia, Nordic, what's the difference? Or perhaps there's another way to count, which would be to think of one supranational region united by European integration and now, right, NATO membership. That is an important identity. Of course, Schengen, the passport union, ties them together as well. The European economy, there's so many things that are binding this region together in very, very significant ways. And that is the question that our speaker will contemplate tonight, and I am looking forward to hearing his thoughts on that topic. In fact, I cannot think of a better or more distinguished scholar or a more lively speaker, set that expectation bar very high, to discuss these questions. Professor Daunis Auers is visiting Fulbright Professor of Scandinavian Studies at the University of Washington, where it has been an extraordinary pleasure to host him since September. I said before the event tonight that I was a little bit intimidated to introduce him. He has a very long list of accomplishments, but also he is a very funny man. Again, I'm just going to ratchet up those, lever up the expectations there to make sure we appreciate all he has to offer to us. Professor Auers is the author or editor of 6 books and numerous articles on Baltic politics, European politics in the Baltics, European integration, populism, and comparative politics in the Nordic region. At the University of Washington, he's working on a book on that supranational region. And so it's a really cutting-edge piece of work that I look forward to seeing out in publication in the next year or two. Professor Auers has held many prestigious titles, including currently Jean Monnet Chair for major study projects studying the EU and Latvia, in addition to many, many other titles. I just mentioned his political activities as well. He currently serves as an advisor to the President of Latvia on the Competitiveness Commission. So he is bringing us not only scholarly knowledge, but knowledge from his activities in the political world. So you can see what I mean when I say we could not have a more apt choice of a scholar to speak on this topic tonight. Thank you, Professor Auers, for being here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Daunis Auers to speak on the topic, not the joke, how many Nordic states?
Wow, thank you, Andy, for those kind words. I'm so happy that this is being recorded so I can show my wife, because she won't believe that. She was here with me together with my daughter for the first couple of months when we were here, but they've just returned now to Latvia for the start of the school year. First, I'd like to give a big thanks to the National Nordic Museum for hosting this talk, and of course to Andy and his colleagues at the Department of Scandinavian Studies for hosting me for these last 5 months. It is an absolutely unique resource, staffed by superb administrators, academics. Please do support the work of the museum and the department. They are, as I say, absolutely unique. After all, I live in Northeastern Europe, but I've come here to work on a book about Northeastern Europe, which tells you something about the facilities, the people, the resources that we have here. And let's continue supporting them in the future. And of course, also, so many thanks to you for coming out tonight. I guess, all the rest of Seattle will stop because of a bit of snow, but not people interested in the Nordics and the Baltics. I mean, it's going to take more than that to stop you coming out. Now, some things in this world of ours are, unchanging. The sun sets in the west. We're all going to die at some stage. And a middle-aged professor will exceed his allocated speaking time, right? So I have about 30 minutes we spoke about. I'm going to try to stick to that, but we know how that's going to work out. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the book project that I've been working on while I've been here, which Andy sketched in. It's a work in progress, and I welcome any comments or critiques or questions you have in the Q&A, or indeed afterwards when we're having a drink. I'd also like to start with two caveats, which have come out from previous talks that I've given about this. So this project, and what I'm going to talk about today, is not a critique of the Nordic states. That's absolutely not its intention. Nor am I being a cheerleader for the Baltic states either. Rather, this project is about trying to understand the state of the states of a region. What Northeastern Europe, the Nordic and the Baltic region actually is like today. And of course, we're talking about the 5 Nordic states and the 3 Baltic states. Russia, Germany, Poland, of course, edge onto our region. They're on the Baltic Sea, but they're not Northeast European states. The bulk of their territory is elsewhere, and they certainly don't identify themselves as being Northeast European either. So we are left with these 5 Nordic and 3 Baltic states, which are broadly similar. I think we would all agree. The population sizes are small, from very small, Iceland's 375,000 people, to Sweden as the giant of a region with 10.5 million. And the location on the wintry periphery of Europe. There are, of course, also many historic links. Now, I did think about whether I should mention this one, because I have a very patriotic Dane in the office next to me in the university, and I'm a bit worried that Morten will start crying when I mention this. But it is a fact that the Danish flag fell from the heavens during a battle in what is Tallinn today in 1219. So there are all kinds of old links like this, although the Danish government, very sober, very kind of practical administration, they kind of ruined the effect, because when I was reading the official description of this, on the Danish government webpage, they mentioned this incident, warriors losing, the flag appears, they rally, they fight, they win, and at the end, the Danish government writes, the story of the falling flag obviously has no basis in reality, which kind of, kills it. But still, it's a nice idea. And Riga, for example, was the second biggest town in Sweden during the 17th century. So all kinds of historic links, parliamentary democracies, we're market economies, we're centralized, we're all going to be NATO members soon, and so on. But there are, of course, some differences. Iceland and Norway are not in the European Union, the key institution for the Baltic states, for example. Only half of the states in the region share a currency, the euro. And, of course, there's big differences in their wealth in the region. But the thing is, the books, social science books on the region, don't exist. Typically, there are books on the Nordic states, the politics, the economics of the Nordic states, and there might be books on the Baltic states as well. But apart from a few historians like Michael North or David Kirby, there haven't really been many texts that look at the region as a whole, which is quite strange because the states are very, very comparable. Now, what I'm doing in this work is wondering why this is so. Now, one of the reasons might be that the Nordic states are the Baltic states are overshadowed by the Nordic states. And I mean, it's clear that the Nordic states are very, very well known. Last weekend, I was wandering around Ballard here. I'd gone to the farmer's market on the Sunday. And I went to the Trader Joe's supermarket here. And in the Trader Joe's, there's a little sign on the wall, an invitation for children. And I quote, "Hey kids, our friend Eldingar the Viking is hiding somewhere in the store. Let us know if you spot him and claim your sweet reward," right? So let's send our children to go look for this murderous pillager. Fantastic. Now, I came out of Trader Joe's, and just across the road, there's a sort of all-day diner thing there that says, it offers not just pancakes, but offers Swedish pancakes, because, of course, by adding something Nordic, you add value to it. And by the way, so you don't have to do it, I tried out those pancakes. They are not particularly Swedish, shall we say. I've actually had Swedish pancakes. I've had real Swedish military pancakes, like they're supposed to be served on a Thursday, on a military base, on an island, actually, by Karlskrona, starting with a pea soup, followed by the pancakes and the whipped cream. And this was something a little bit different. But again, it hammered home the idea the Nordics are something good, right? How can we sell a pancake? Let's call it a Swedish pancake. And, wherever you go in America or Europe, this is reflected on, for instance, the bookshelves of the region. You go to any bookshop in provincial Wales, for example, and there will be books, the same as we have here, on Viking economics, or the Nordic theory of everything, or the year of living Danishly, uncovering the secrets of a world's happiest country, or a book which caught my eye, The Swedish Art of Aging Exuberantly, and even some racy romantic novels. My favorite, this is a whole subgenre that I wasted several hours on looking at, but my favorite is a book called Nordic Lightning, which has a strong-looking sort of young man with his shirt off on the cover, and has the best tagline, I think, ever written. Hockey was my game, she was my goal. God, I wish I'd written those words. But again, it's Nordic lightning, not Baltic lightning, of course. And in contrast, the Baltic states have a very low profile. When they are mentioned or portrayed, it is often in a negative way. But more often enough, they just don't figure in this way. And I find this very interesting, because 25 years ago, when I sort of started researching the politics and economics of the Baltic states, this was absolutely true. The Baltic states in the 1990s were nutcases, right? It was a very, very strange time, a time of transition, a time of change. And, I made a pretty good living publishing, articles which were pointing out how different the political system was, how different the political parties were, how government operated, and so on. But this is no longer the case. I mean, the way the Baltic states operate today is as small, sober European Union countries. But this doesn't seem to be reflected in the general perception that people have. So very often, when people talk about the Baltics, and I hear this all the time, they talk about the corruption in the Baltics, and you hear international advisors tell you about the corruption. However, it's Sweden's Telia, a formerly state-owned telecommunications company, that in 2017 paid a fine here in the US, in New York, of $965 million, $965 million fine, to settle a 2012 corruption case involving paying bribes to the daughter of the president of Uzbekistan. In 2022, so just over a year ago, Danske Bank, the Danish bank, paid a fine of $2.4 billion to US authorities. It was accused of laundering at least $200 billion through its Estonian branch. In the same year, there was a case started against ABLV executives, a Latvian bank, which was also accused of money laundering, for just 2 billion euros, right? So 1% of the laundering that Danske Bank was accused of Yet it's the Latvian banking system which has been reformed, international sort of pressure on it, looking over it, the Kapitālais remonts, so the big renovation, as it was called in Latvian. And it's almost impossible to open a bank account in Latvia now as a result of this. But in Denmark, things go on as normal. And in the 1990s, and I remember this well, this was a time when human rights observers were very concerned with the Russian minority in the Baltic states, and Danish officials, for example, frequently chided Latvia and Estonia for being slow in adopting restrictive citizenship laws. However, for the last couple of years, it's Denmark that's been criticized by Amnesty International for setting up a new procedure by which they transfer asylum seekers away from Denmark and off to Rwanda in Africa. In the same way, the Baltic states have a reputation of being unstable. Yet in 2021, Sweden's first female prime minister spent exactly 7 hours in office before resigning and then taking off the office again the next day. Now, what I found strange here was not the 7 hours, but the fact that this was Sweden's first female executive leader in 2021. By then, all 3 Baltic states had had female prime ministers, and all 3 had also had female presidents. In fact, at the moment, all 3 Baltic states have female prime ministers in office. In summer 2023, Latvia elected Europe's first openly gay president to the office. And in the fall of that year, Hossam Abulmeri, a naturalized Muslim Latvian, became Latvia's Minister of Health. Yet, it's the Nordics who are considered progressive, not the Baltics. Okay. And then last year, a senior US diplomat at a diplomatic event urged Latvia to develop, right, its democracy, which also I found very interesting, because even at that time, the US State Department-funded Freedom House, Freedom in the World report had the US behind all 3 Baltic states in the quality of democracy. On a 100-point scale, Estonia is 94, Lithuania 89, Latvia 88, and the US 83. But it's the US teaching the Baltics about democracy. Now, I'm not the first person to have commented on this. I mean, the former Estonian president, Thomas Hendrik Ilves, has basically made a career of talking about these things, having a legendary Twitter spat with Paul Krugman a decade and a half ago. And in a sense, this Nordic-Baltic divide, which I'm kind of talking about, is a microcosm of a broader divide which we have in Europe between East and West, something which the Romanian writer Mircea Ceausescu has elegantly captured. As she wrote, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. Civilization, neurosis, chaos. Prosperity, culture, chaos. Right? That we have these kind of like mental maps within us that automatically say, this is good, West is good, Nordics is good, East is good, Baltics, well, that's a bit shifty. In a recent article, the Estonian professor of history at the University College London, Mart Kuldkepp, described this as Euro-Orientalism, specifically referring to this divide with the Baltic states as being the sort of northern tip of Eastern Europe and looking over at the Nordic states in Western Europe. And I particularly like the idea that the German historian Beatrice von Hirschhausen has elaborated, which is the idea of phantom borders that exist. So borders which once were, like the Soviet borders, like the borders in Eastern Europe which existed, and on the one side we had the communist countries, and on the other side we had the free capitalistic countries, that these still exist in our minds, and we can't eradicate them even when the situation on the ground changes. And these things are important. This isn't just a sort of abstract discussion, an abstract idea that's being developed. It's kind of the answer to the so what. Well, why write about this? Why research this question? Well, the reason why it's important is because these negative perceptions impact very directly countries. They, for example, reduce the attractiveness of a place economically. And that, after all, is why countries spend so much money on place branding these days, trying to create positive public perceptions by using marketing and PR techniques, and spending a lot of money on that. And they do this because negative perceptions affect you economically as a destination for foreign direct investment. I mean, if there's a stereotype that you're corrupt, then maybe better to go to a country where you're less likely to pay bribes, especially bearing in mind the sanctions that American companies face if they undertake these kind of risks of paying bribes. It can affect tourism. It affects the value added to your product. I still remember I saw a crib in Latvia made by a Latvian company, but for a Finnish producer or sales front. And in Latvia, this crib, beautifully made, cost 300 euros. And a couple of months later, I was in New York wandering around, and I can't remember why. I'm sure my wife wanted to, maybe we were expecting a child or something. And we ended up looking at cribs there in New York. And there, lo and behold, was the same crib, made in Latvia, but sold as made in the European Union, Danish design, and 3,000 dollars instead of 300 euros. So you add value by having this positive perception. And then, of course, there is a political thing to this as well. Nikki Haley yesterday in the Republican candidate debate on TV, similar to Chris Christie at previous debates, mentioned that, if Ukraine doesn't win, then Putin is coming after the Baltics, after Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And she didn't say Finland. If the discussion had been 100 years ago, then Finland would have been tacked on, of course, as a country recently broken away from Russia, as a country at that time that was more Baltic than Nordic. But it no longer is, because Finland has a different identity. It's a Nordic country, so it's safe. And there's also an impact on how we see ourselves, on what is known as auto-stereotypes, or self-images. Now, some of you are maybe familiar with Dr. Seuss and the writings of Dr. Seuss. But here we could refer to one of his books, which I wasn't familiar with until quite recently, but The Sneetches. And the Sneetches live in a world where there are superior Sneetches because they have a star on their bellies. And these Sneetches are super confident, they're content, they're happy. And then there are those who are identical in every way, but they don't have that star. And they've internalized this, that they are inferior because they don't have a star, and they walk around depressed, unhappy, and so on. And this is a kind of simplified version of what genuinely happens. Auto-stereotypes do impact a country as well, if you're constantly sort of being knocked down. It can affect the demographic trends. Well, if our country's not faring well, and the politicians are corrupt, and everybody pays bribes, and if things are horrible here, then you're more likely to take off somewhere else, especially in the European Union free market, where you can resettle in any EU state absolutely freely. It can also affect things like social capital, which is interpersonal trust. It can affect trust towards key political institutions, well-being, satisfaction, also economic development. So these things are important. How we see ourselves, how others see us, they are interconnected, and they do have a long-term impact. So how have I investigated these issues? How have I approached them? Well, first of all, I've tried to understand what are regions and how do regions form. Now, the key thing here is that regions are elastic. They are entirely constructed. They're not really related to territory. They're not really related to geography. Europe has no fixed borders. Greenland, because of its relationship with Denmark, is considered to be a part of Europe, even though it is 1,700 miles from the closest European Union member state, but is only 16 miles from Canada. But we consider it European because of its political status with Denmark. So this raises a number of questions. Why can't Canada join the EU if Greenland is 16 miles away? Why not? Canadians are kind of European, right? They have publicly funded healthcare, they have some redistribution, they speak English and French, they would be, quite frankly, quite easy to absorb into the European Union. So why not? I mean, they meet all the criteria. Or, of course, why can't Greenland join North America? Donald Trump, of course, tried by making an offer. But why not? And, you know, this goes on. Just this summer, the Orkney Islands, so a small collection of islands off the north-east coast of Scotland, openly started discussing their local authority, breaking away from the United Kingdom, and perhaps forming a relationship with Norway or with Denmark. And Scotland, we too know that the Scottish National Party, which absolutely dominates Scottish politics, also sees itself as a Nordic country in the future. And that's how it tries to sell independence to voters. Vote for us, we will create what one of the former leaders of the Scottish National Party called an arc of prosperity. You know, from Ireland through Iceland through to Norway, and with Scotland smack in the middle. Small, prosperous, harmonious nations. So, you know, Europe is a very fluid thing. I mean, we don't know where the eastern border of Europe is. People say the Ural Mountains, but this is a construction by Russian czars to make sure that Moscow and St. Petersburg would be included in the conception of Europe. I mean, there's no reason to choose the Ural Mountains. You could choose any other mountain range. And this is a real-life issue, too. I forget exactly when it was, but about sort of 10, 15 years ago, European Union leaders met at a special meeting in Brussels, purely to discuss where the borders of Europe lie. Because this is an important issue to do with enlargement, right? So when do we stop enlarging? When do we stop growing? And after a day of debate, they gave up, and they realized they couldn't do it, right? That it was impossible to define where the borders end, who is European, and who isn't. And so this is the first thing to understand. Regions are fluid, they're elastic, they're changing, although the changes tend to take place over time. And regions typically have three core features, especially the most successful identifiable ones. They have a name, they have a place, and they have an idea. And if we look to northeastern Europe at the moment, we can see why the Nordics are such a cohesive region, because they fulfill all these criteria. They have, of course, a name. Scandinavia and the Nordics are used pretty much interchangeably, but we know what we're talking about when we mention them. They have a place, right? They are these 5 countries and 3 other territories also represented in the wonderful museum here, which together make up the Nordics, right? That's who they are at the moment. But 100 years, of course, Finland wouldn't have been a part of this Norden. And Iceland possibly wouldn't have been as well. I mean, there is a core, so any region has a core. And in the Nordics, it's Sweden and Denmark, the 2 post-colonial countries. And perhaps a little bit Norway. But the periphery is up for discussion, is up for debate. And this is actually also reflected in the way that the Nordics see themselves as well. A 2023 YouGov poll in the UK to do with this Scottish independence thing I mentioned carried out large-scale polls in the Nordic states. And they found that 86% of Danes believed that Sweden and Norway as countries were similar to Denmark. However, in Denmark, 71% believed that Finland and Iceland were similar. So there was a closer affinity to the core, less to the periphery. But in any case, more than they believed that there was an affinity to England or Scotland, which ranked 62% and 58% respectively. And then the same poll found also the same thing in Sweden, that 82% of Swedes thought that Denmark and, in this case, Finland were similar to Sweden, because, of course, Finland is closer for historical reasons to Sweden than perhaps other territories. About the same, 83% about Norway, but just 65% thought the same about Iceland, which is much more the periphery for Swedes. So there is a difference between the center and the edges of a region. Now, the Baltic states as a region are far less defined. Now, these days, when we say the Baltic states, yeah, we know what we're talking about. It's also clear that there are these three countries of which we speak. But even here, there is maybe some dissension, because famously, Estonia is an unhappy Baltic country. I mean, I have a friend here, a historian, who wrote a book complaining that the Baltics were not a region. This is Baltic Facades by Aldis Purs, a splendid book I'd recommend everybody to read. The Baltics did not exist as a region, but it was mostly an outside construction. And, you know, there's a lot of truth to this. I mean, Estonia famously has tried to reorientate itself away from the Nordics, from the Baltics, and build itself up as the new Nordics. Various attempts have been made. I think the most memorable one by Thomas Hendrik Ilves, the Estonian president I mentioned, who talked about the Yule countries, the countries which celebrate Christmas and call it the Yule period, which were Nordic countries plus the United Kingdom, and of course Estonia, which seemed to be Estonia trying to escape from its Baltic partners. So the Baltics are a weaker region. And this definitely also affects how they're understood, because then the next phase is to try to understand the image that they have. And I do this through using the concept of stereotypes, or specifically xenostereotypes. So a xenostereotype is a stereotype about a nation, a country, a state. And these xenostereotypes are preconceived and oversimplified ideas of the positive or negative characteristics which typify a person or group of people. Now, stereotypes are sticky. When a stereotype is formed in your mind, and you don't even notice it being formed, it's very difficult to rechange that, even when the evidence on the ground says so. So it's very similar to these phantom borders, which the German historian Beatrice von Hirschhausen talks about too. Now, they're formed usually over time. So we build our perception of the Nordic states by little things, like the happy Viking in Trader Joe's. We turn on our Netflix, and we can choose from dozens of shows and documentaries about Vikings. We have these positive books. We have these words which go into international languages like hygge, which I can't really begin to explain, but I think it's something to do with well-being. It's wearing a sweater in front of a flaming, something, having a cup of tea in your hand, and you feel hygge. And apparently we need to write books about this now. So typically they're developed over time through the family, through school, through other socialization processes. But sometimes stereotypes are formed at sudden moments, when something suddenly takes place. And then this event is something which shifts our perceptions of something. And I would say that this is how our xenostereotype of the Baltic states have formed, because most people wouldn't have known, wouldn't have thought about the Baltic states in the Cold War era. It was a niche subject. But then, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the Baltic states appear. The heroes, or one of the heroes of the collapse of the Soviet Union, plucky small countries standing up to Soviet oppression, and then they go into the terror and the horror of the economic, political, and social transition in the 1990s. And this is the time that the Baltics come onto the mental map of people. And you can see this if you take a quantitative measure, for example, of news stories about this. So I looked into the Newsbank database, looking at the Financial Times, which I think is really the world's only real global newspaper, and for articles with the terms Baltic states by year. And generally, very, very little interest. Goes up a little bit in the late 1980s, and then 1991, the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are 483 articles. And then we sink down again, slowly but steadily, with fewer articles on the Baltic, until we have economic crash in 1998, and a surge in the number of articles again to 298. And then when we had the really big economic crash in the Baltic states in 2007, 2008, then in 2008, there are 404 articles again. And much of these articles, not just in the Financial Times, but elsewhere, are sort of poverty porn. You know, stories about how bad things are, how people are struggling, you know, this madcap country, or these madcap states suffering these huge crises. And this is what stays on the mental map of people. And that's not to say that wasn't true of a time, but it's not necessarily true many decades later. Now, it's quite difficult pinpointing xenostereotypes because they're something that live within us. Very often we self-censor. We don't necessarily talk about them. I will be, when I return to Latvia, I'll be using a Harvard implicit association test, which is a tool that you can use that measures attitudes and beliefs that people are generally unwilling to report or unable to report. But I don't have that data at the moment. So I've been mostly looking at qualitative things. So, for example, there's a book called The Atlas of Prejudice, which is made up of cartoons drawn by a cynical cartoonist, but which try to reflect the way in which others see the world or see certain continents. And so one of the maps in this book is the Europe according to Norway. Right? And so these are the stereotypes that Norwegians have about Europeans. Now, I'm obviously not going to tell you all of these, but Europe, according to Norway, is, well, Sweden are the poor neighbors. Denmark, people with a speech disorder. That's, okay. Finland, and this is a clear reference to the Game of Thrones, are the wildlings. And the Baltic states, they're just thrown together, no borders, all together, and it just says criminals. All right, there's another one of these in the same book, Europe according to Sweden. And in this one, the Danes are xenophobes. Denmark's not getting a good ride from this, is it? The Finns are party poopers. Not sure what that means, but okay, that's an thing. And again, the Baltics are grouped together, and this time it just says mafia. Okay, right, this is a book published 2 years ago. All right. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Then, of course, I thought, why am I wasting time on this? I could be enjoying Seattle. I'm just going to ask ChatGPT. What do they say? And I asked ChatGPT for 3 stereotypes of these regions. And to be honest, the results were a bit disappointing because it says, you know, stereotypes are not very nice. We shouldn't use them. It has a caveat, and then it tells you them. So for the Baltics, it was cold and gloomy weather. That's not really it's not about the people, is it? But reserved and introverted people and post-Soviet economic struggles. And for the Nordics, well, broadly speaking, they're more positive, but not really conclusive evidence here. The Nordics are also described as reserved and introverted. Secondly, socialist. And third, blonde, blue-eyed, and tall. Which, by the way, is incorrect. The Balts are taller than the Nordics. Check the data. So it's not even true. And then there's also perhaps the way we see ourselves. And Estonia is quite honest on this. In the official Estonian webpage, where they try to sell the country, Visit Estonia, it's called. They have a little section there that says things people assume about the Baltics. So not just about them, but about the Baltic states. And I'll just take 3 of the things which they write here, these assumptions. Everybody speaks Russian. It's scary Eastern Europe. And we live in the Stone Age. So this is how the Balts think that others look at them, which is again, a form of xeno stereotype. So, I mean, I would say that even without having particularly conclusive evidence, I mean, I think we can see that there is a difference between the Nordics and the Baltics. But how true is this? And this is the bulk of the work which I've been doing and which I'll be doing also going forwards. How does this actually match the reality on the ground? Are the Baltics really that different? And to look at this, I'm taking the Nordic model, which has these 3 dimensions, economics, welfare, and politics. And doing a broad-based comparison of the regions. And so beginning with the economic model. Now, this is quite central to the xenostereotype of the Nordic states. The Nordics are rich, and the Baltics are not. And of course, in a sense, this is true. But it isn't perhaps as true as the xenostereotype would have. So if you look at the World Bank's most recent data on global economies, GDP per capita measured at price purchasing parity, because things cost different prices in different countries. Well, Norway is the top-ranked Nordic country, comes in 4th. Just for context, USA comes in 10th. Denmark, 11th. Iceland, 13th. Sweden, 19th. Finland, 24th. Okay, so all 5 Nordic states in the top 25. But the Baltic states aren't that far behind. Lithuania is 38th. Estonia, 41st. Latvia, 53rd. And then if you actually look at the data, so Iceland, for example, has Finland has a per capita of $59,000 a GDP per capita at PPP. Lithuania is $49,000. $10,000 difference. That's exactly the same difference as it is between Finland and Iceland. So there's great variation within the Nordic states as well. And in any case, we shouldn't be surprised by this. After all, the Nordic-Baltic region shares a history of economic development. Late 19th century, urbanization, industrialization starts, big enterprises appear, peasants flock from the villages and the rural countryside to the cities, especially in the Baltic states. The cities become quite international, with people coming from all over the Russian Empire and elsewhere in Europe. And they're broadly comparative, the cities are. Certainly Sweden is much wealthier than the modern territory of Latvia, Estonia, and especially Lithuania. But the cities, Riga and Stockholm would be quite comparable, and Riga would certainly be wealthier than Helsinki, for example, at this time. But then you have the First World War, which literally wipes out industrial production in the Baltic states. Production facilities are literally lifted up, put on trains, and transported to Russia, never to return. The banks which work in a region also leave, go elsewhere, back to Western Europe. And then you have some pretty disastrous economic politics in interwar Baltic states as well, a lot of autarky. Why do we need to import shoes when we can make our own, for example? Well, because we don't make them very well, but still, that's what we do. And so this isn't a particularly productive economic time. Then you have a Second World War, destruction, communism come in, even a further destruction of the economy, despite capital investments. Those investments aren't very qualitative. And then 1991, the Baltic states appear after having lived through 75 very, very difficult years. And in contrast, the Nordics flourished. I mean, probably best not to talk about the Second World War and Sweden's booming economy based on exports of armed goods. But anyway, we have this quick economic growth. And this is important. Why? Well, time is ticking, so let's go on to the social model. You need money to pay for the social model. But if you look at how the social model was introduced in the Nordic states, it was introduced gradually. We accrue wealth. So let's take Sweden as an example. Between 1870 and 1970, Sweden had the second fastest growing economy in the world. Only Japan grew economically faster. And in 1970, Sweden was the 4th wealthiest country by GDP per capita in the world. But only then did Sweden introduce many of the things which are characteristic of Sweden. Free dental care, parental benefits, unemployment insurance, job security laws were passed in 1974. Benefits for industrial injuries in 1977. Before then, there was a social welfare system, but it was relatively bare-boned. And this is true, more or less, in the other Nordic states as well. But in the Baltic states, they had to introduce these pretty much straight away. Why? Because there was international pressure. There were international advisors who were coming, telling them what to do. So The Baltic states, they didn't receive Marshall Plan money. The Nordic states did, except for Finland. Sweden received the equivalent of about $3 billion in today's money in its Marshall Plan, despite its economy growing every year during the Second World War. But Baltic states didn't get any of that. They didn't get any of these grants in the 1990s. What they got was experts, technical experts coming and telling judges how to make decisions, telling policemen not to take bribes, and also advising governments on the need for welfare systems and so on. And the result is that the Baltic states have these welfare systems in place. It's absolutely incorrect to say that there is no welfare in the Baltics. But because the economy lags that of the Nordic states, they are less generous, with only a couple of exceptions. I mean, one exception, for example, is cash benefits to families. All three Baltic states spend more as a percentage of their GDP on cash benefits to families than the Nordic states do. And, for instance, Estonia and Lithuania outspend Sweden and Norway on active labor market policies, which means spending on unemployment benefits, training programs, subsidies to businesses to hire unemployed people, and so on. But these are exceptions. Broadly speaking, the Nordics spend more money. But the Baltics have them. They just are relatively of low quality, or comparatively low quality, because the budget doesn't allow for it. I mean, if you're talking about the medical system, a CT scanner costs what it costs. It'll be more or less the same for Sweden as it will be for Latvia. And you're in this international market for pharmaceuticals and so on, but you don't necessarily have the finances to fund what you would like. So here we see some congruence, but of course it's much more generous in the Nordics. And Andy is looking at me very aggressively, even though I'm trying not to look at him, because I know that time is ticking. So let me keep the final part, the political part, short. The Nordic model of politics has traditionally been one of consensus. Peaceful, co-harmony, political parties embedded in society, cooperating with each other peacefully in parliament, passing good policies, and so on. Well, that doesn't really exist anymore. Governments fluctuate more in the Nordic states than they do in the Baltic states. If you look over a 15-year period, for example, there's been an average of, not a big difference here, but there's been an average of 4.3 prime ministers in each Nordic state. In this period, 4.6, and in the Baltic states, 4.3. There are disruptor parties in the Nordic states now, like the Finns party in Finland, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, which have far greater political support than similar disruptor parties in the Baltic states, like EKRE in Estonia, for example, the Estonian Conservative Party, which despite its name is a very radical political party. But as time is ticking, I'll sum up. So the picture that is emerging of a region from this analysis is that the Nordic states are, of course, far wealthier than the Baltic states. Convergence is taking place, and I have some data about that we can talk about later if we wish, but it's taking place relatively slowly, but it's taking place. The Baltic states do have a generous set of welfare provisions in terms of scope, but not the finances to really make these provisions very, very qualitative, like to have a full cradle-to-grave healthcare service, for example. But in politics, the convergence has already taken place, and I would say that Baltic politics is no different to Nordic politics in its substance these days. And then, then we come to the question, well, how many Nordic states? Well, of course, it's 5. And next year, it will be 5. But I would say it's an open question how many there will be in 2050 or 2100, because we are seeing convergence in the region. There's a Nordic core, Sweden, Denmark, that doesn't change. There's a periphery, which is far more fluid, far more elastic. And I'd say if the Baltic states continue their development path, then the idea of an expanded Nordic region, a Norden plus, perhaps isn't as outlandish as it might sound. And I did tell you I was going to talk much longer than I should, so you were forewarned. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Andy now, who has promised to walk around with a microphone and take any questions or comments if there are any, so we have some time for that now.
Perception of corruption, particularly in Estonia and Latvia, is because the higher percentage of the population is Russian, whom we all have the xeno stereotype as corrupt.
Yeah, I mean, the corruption data is actually very interesting because in the perceptions data, which Amnesty International bases its research on, people are asked, does corruption exist in this country? Oh, yes. But then there are other things, like the World Bank used to have a doing business report where it would ask businessmen, have you been offered a bribe in the last year? Have you received a bribe? Have you solicited a bribe? Have you seen it taking place? And the results are actually the same as in the Nordics. So there's a perception that, that corruption is happening all around me. It's just that I'm not involved in it, but I'm sure that other people are.
One distinction that you didn't mention, and I may not be part of your research, is language. Because 3 of the Nordic countries share language roots. 4, I guess, with Iceland, not Finland. And the languages of the Baltic states, I don't know whether they're related to one another, but they're quite different than the Nordic states. And that has a lot to do with history, has a lot to do with their cultures as well. I wanted your response to that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The language is a unifier, but I would say that language is at the core. I'm sure there are better people that can speak of this than I can, but as I understand it, Icelandic isn't a particularly easy language that translates over to Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, and of course Finnish certainly doesn't. So in the core, you have this language commonality, but you can still have a strong regional identity even without that. But you're absolutely right, the Baltic languages are, despite Lithuanian and Latvian having similar roots, they're not really comprehensible to each other. There's a question here, Andy.
I have a friend whose parents were born in Lithuania, and one of the things I'm wondering about is Belarus and Lithuania, because aren't people from Belarus trying to escape to Lithuania, and the Lithuanian president is trying to be as helpful as possible? And so do Nordic states have more danger with what's surrounding them than the Nordic states? Except for I have heard that at one point immigrants were going through Russia and coming through the backside of Norway or something, but probably not very many. But I guess I'm just wondering if that's something that is true and will remain true or not.
Well, yeah, Latvia and Estonia share a border with Russia, Latvia, Lithuania with Belarus, and of course Finland and Norway also have a border with Russia. And the border is a weak point for NATO, essentially. But we're seeing very similar trends across these borders. So about 2 or 3 years ago, Belarus started advertising the easy route to Europe through Belarus into either Poland, Lithuania, or Latvia. And then you had these illegal immigrants coming over the border into these states, and these states very often pushing them back, now building fences and trying to stop it. Now, what was interesting is that this was going on in the Baltic states for quite some time, and then in the fall last year, it started happening in Finland, and then all of a sudden it made the big news everywhere. Because when it's happening in Finland, it's more important than happening in the Baltic states. And I think even it's touched on Norway, as you mentioned now. But yeah, I mean, this is a problem, the border. I'm not sure what you meant by Lithuanians trying to get Belarusians out. More or less, the Baltic states are not really open to Russia or Belarus at the moment. So it's unless it's somebody from the opposition, in Belarusian opposition, then Lithuania is open, but generally for economic migrants, not so much.
Thank you, Professor, for coming to give this talk. I heard you talk a little bit about the concept of democracy and the Baltic states being lectured about being more democratic. I remember reading an article, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago. I think it was Estonia, where all voting is now done electronically on their phones. And they track, and the participation rate is off the charts. And then you look at that compared to the United States voting rates. Can you comment a little bit about that, about how the Baltic state political democratic participation is in the Baltic states, please?
Yeah, actually, participation isn't so good in the Baltic states. This is somewhere where the Nordics absolutely have a lead. Voting in elections, all classes of elections, is much higher in the Nordic states and the Baltic states, even Estonia. Now, you're absolutely right. In Estonia, you can vote on your phone. And in the last election, about half of all voters chose to vote by their phone. But turnout wasn't particularly high. It's about 60%, as I recall off the top of my head. In the Nordic states, it's usually about 20 percentage points higher, the participation. That's the thing about voting by telephone. It doesn't necessarily increase turnout. It just makes it easier for you to vote.
Hi there. I am from Denmark, born and bred. So what you're talking about tonight, I find it acutely interesting, and I am embarrassed to say that I do share some of these stereotypical notions about the Baltics. And I'm curious about what you talk about wealth. Because you're mentioning that GDP-wise, the Baltic states do not fall very far behind from the Nordics. At the same time, the welfare state program is unable to finance itself at a level that it would like to. So what is it? Are you that unwealthy or not?
Well, again, the Nordic states introduced welfare systems when they were already amongst the wealthiest countries in the world. Essentially when they had fiscal space in their budgets because money was pouring in, and they could redirect it towards social programs. Whereas the Baltic states introduced these welfare programs at a time of very, very tight budgetary space, which we still have today. And as a result, they have the laws in place. They have child benefits, unemployment benefits, and all these other things, but they're just less generous. And, it is mostly because there is less money available. I mean, if we want to do a comparison, for example, between the GDP of Denmark and the Baltic states. So the way it's usually done in the European Union, the comparison is we look at average GDP in the European Union and say that's 100%. So this is GDP at price purchasing parity. That's 100%. And if you have more than 100%, then you're wealthier than average. And if you have less, then you're poorer than average. And actually, I didn't jot down the data for Denmark, but Sweden, for example, today is 119% of the average. Lithuania is 89% of the average. So we are below the average. Sweden is above. What's interesting is that convergence is taking place. Because in 2011, and this data that I have is from 2022, Sweden had 138% of the European average, but they've slid down. Finland has also just fractionally slid down from 119 in 2011 to 2022 today. But the Baltic states are all on the rise, but significant differences still exist. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I hope I did.
Why are the Nordics becoming poorer and the Baltics becoming wealthier? And I guess why aren't the Baltics as wealthy as the Nordics? Is it international investments?
Oh, it's time.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes time to accrue capital. And if we look at the Baltic states in the 1990s, everything had to go. There were no businesses from the Soviet era that could be transformed into the local market economy. No major businesses. They made minibuses in Latvia, the Latvia minibus, which nobody wanted to buy. As soon as it was possible to buy a 25-year-old minibus from Volkswagen from Germany, then the 25-year-old minibus was imported because they were of terrible quality because of the way in which management worked in Soviet enterprises. There was no services, hotels, tourism, telecommunications, all these other typical services we have didn't exist. And they had to be built from scratch throughout the 1990s. So, all these tasks were probably completed about the time of European Union accession in the early 21st century. So we've had, 20 years or so of relatively fast economic growth. But again, the Nordic states had more or less uninterrupted economic growth throughout the 21st century. The Baltic states didn't. So, you can't make up 70 years of backwardness or 75 years of backwardness over 20 or 30 years. It'll take a lot more than that.
Okay, hi, thank you for speaking. I want to go back 600 years and just have a question about whether the Hanseatic League had any relationship on how these various countries developed in the area.
Yeah, I mean, the Hanseatic League was very important in making sure that the region didn't fall too far behind Western Europe, and the merchants, the international merchants who came, the gossip that would come, the fashions that would come, which were probably most accurately reflected in the architecture of the different Hanseatic League cities. Certainly the Hanseatic League was important in keeping the periphery of Europe, which the Nordics and the Baltics are, informed with the trends at the time. But as for impact on the modern day, probably not so much. There is this idea of a Hanseatic League 2.0, which is the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, plus the Netherlands and Ireland, who work as a lobbying group within the European Union. But that would be the only thing that I can think of that sort of carries over to the current day.
How do the birth rates compare between Nordic countries and Baltic countries? Does population increase or population decline? It's
decline. Every European Union country has a negative birth rate. Not a single one has a positive. A positive birth rate is 2.0 or 2.1, depending on how you measure it, per woman. And that's been long the case. The only countries with a growing population are those who have immigrants coming in. So, and in fact, because of these I mentioned these child benefits, the cash benefits, which are larger in the Baltic states than the Nordics, in recent years, actually, the birth rate in the Baltic states has overtaken some of the Nordic countries, but still well below the 2.0 needed.
I hope this isn't too far out of the topic, but in view of current events, how do the Baltic countries we were discussing in terms of their ability to participate in NATO compared to the Swedes and the Finns, for instance?
Well, the Baltic militaries are smaller. All the Baltic states spend well over 2%. In fact, all of them by 2025 will be spending 3% of GDP. But of course, the GDP is smaller than it is, and a HIMARS costs what a HIMARS costs. The Baltic states, shall we say, they do what they can. They're highly militarized. All three now have conscription systems. Latvia introduced one last year. There's a lot of focus on national defense, including how civil defense is a part of military defense. But again, small countries, when faced with a big aggressive neighbor, are of course reliant on their allies. And that's why you could say, the big success of the Baltic states over the last 30 years has probably been foreign policy, getting into the EU, getting into the NATO, when in 1991, to many, that would have seemed like an impossible dream.
A situation that I'm more familiar with regarding the previous question about why they are not at the same level as the Nordics is you look at the situation in East Germany, another situation which I'm much more familiar with, where everything had to be tossed away. There was nothing there that was worth saving. They would have rolled up the roads if they could. And the West Germans have put probably close to $500 billion into East Germany, and it still lags the West by about 30%. And so this is what the Baltics have, and they don't have West Germany financing it.
Yeah, and of course, we didn't have the Marshall Plan in the 1990s, but we had lots of technical experts. Of which I should say I was one in the 90s, but there we go. But that's a different story.
Right, well, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our distinguished lecturer, Professor Daunis.